The smell of burnt crust filled the bakery as David Walsh scraped another ruined loaf into the waste bin. Rustfall's temperamental ovens hated him today, just like they hated everyone who tried to run a business on this dust-covered mining colony at the edge of nowhere. He wiped sweat from his forehead and checked the time display on the wall. 3 hours past midnight. Nobody would buy bread this late anyway. Outside, wind howled through the narrow streets between prefabricated buildings. Rustfall earned its name honestly. Everything here turned orange-brown within days of arriving, covered in the fine metallic dust that blew endlessly across the planet's surface. David had been here 5 years now, ever since he left military service and decided he wanted a quieter life. Baking seemed peaceful compared to coordinating supply drops for combat units. He locked the front door and headed toward the back alley to dump the day's waste. The bakery stood in the market district, surrounded by similar small shops that served the 3,000 colonists who worked the mineral extraction facilities. Most people here were running from something or looking for something. David supposed he was both. The waste container sat against the back wall, illuminated by a single flickering light panel. David lifted the lid and froze. 3 pairs of eyes stared back at him from inside the container, reflecting the dim light like polished mirrors. Small creatures no bigger than house cats covered in what looked like scales that shimmered even in the poor lighting. One of them clutched a piece of packaging material in tiny clawed hands. Another had sauce smeared across its snout. The third, smaller than its companions, cowered behind the others with something that looked remarkably like fear in its expression. David had seen plenty of strange wildlife on frontier worlds. Most colonies had native creatures that learned to scavenge from human settlements. These looked like some kind of lizard, though their proportions seemed off. Too much intelligence in those eyes, too much awareness in the way they watched him, waiting to see what he would do. He lowered the waste bag slowly. The creatures tensed but didn't run. They were hungry. He recognized desperation when he saw it, had seen the same look in the eyes of refugees during his military days. David glanced back toward his bakery. He still had those 3 loaves he'd burned earlier. Not fit to sell, but the insides were fine. He set down the waste bag and went back inside, returning moments later with the bread broken into chunks. The creatures scrambled out of the container with surprising speed. They moved on 4 legs, but occasionally rose on their hind limbs, almost like they could walk upright if they wanted to. David tossed a piece of bread toward them. The largest one, with copper-colored scales, snatched it from the air and devoured it in seconds. The silver-scaled one approached more cautiously, sniffing before eating. The smallest, whose scales held a golden tint, waited until the others had eaten before creeping forward to take its share. David found himself smiling. He tossed them the rest of the bread and watched them eat. When they finished, the copper one looked directly at him and made a sound somewhere between a chirp and a rumble. Then all 3 scattered into the darkness beyond the light panel's reach. The next evening, they returned. David had saved bread specifically for them this time. He put it in a shallow container outside the back door before closing up. In the morning, the container was empty and placed neatly to the side, not scattered or knocked over like an animal would leave it. This pattern continued for days. The creatures arrived like clockwork after dark. David started leaving better food, testing what they preferred. They ate everything but seemed to especially love anything with grains or seeds. He began thinking of them as copper, silver, and gold based on their coloring. By the end of the first week, they no longer ran when he appeared. By the second week, they waited outside his door. David noticed they were growing fast, now the size of medium dogs. Their scales had become more vibrant and small ridges were developing along their spines. Other shop owners started noticing. A woman who ran the clothing repair service 2 buildings down mentioned seeing those lizard things near his bakery. A security officer stopped by to warn him about feeding pests, said it would attract more problems. David nodded politely and continued his routine. The creatures weren't causing trouble. They didn't raid other shops or frighten people. They just came to his bakery, ate what he offered, and left. Sometimes they seemed to understand when he talked to them, tilting their heads at certain words or responding to their names. On the 15th night, everything changed. David was closing up later than usual when he heard shouting from the alley. He rushed out to find a drunk miner stumbling toward his back door, cursing about the noise and the smell of baking that kept him awake in his nearby hab unit. The three creatures emerged from the shadows. They were noticeably larger now, nearly the size of full-grown dogs. Copper moved between David and the drunk miner, rising up on its hind legs to stand almost waist-high. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and it released a sound that made David's bones vibrate. Not quite a growl, more like metal scraping against metal, deep and resonant. The miner's face went pale. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. His words came out in a terrified stammer that cut through the alcoholic haze. "Those aren't animals. Those are dragon spawn. You're keeping dragons." He turned and ran, disappearing between the buildings. David stood motionless, his heart pounding. Dragons, the word echoed in his mind. Dragons were extinct, had been for thousands of years. Everyone knew that. They existed only in ancient records and old stories. But Copper looked back at him with those intelligent, mirror-bright eyes, and David felt something shift in his understanding of the universe. These weren't simple creatures. These weren't ordinary wildlife. And judging by how fast they were growing, he was about to have much bigger problems than burnt bread. Researching ancient extinct species at 4 a.m. was not how David had planned to spend his night. The public database terminal in his small apartment flickered as he scrolled through files that most people probably hadn't accessed in decades. Search terms like dragon, extinct megafauna, and spacefaring reptiles brought up thousands of results, most of them contradictory or classified as mythology rather than science. But some files were different. Academic papers buried in university archives, xenobiology studies marked as historical reference only, military reports from the early days of human space exploration, back when colonies first spread beyond the home system and encountered things they had no names for. Dragons had been real. That much was clear. The images matched what he saw every night in his alley, though the specimens in these old photographs were enormous, the size of small spacecraft. They possessed wings, though how such massive creatures achieved flight remained unclear in the reports. Some scientists theorized anti-gravity organs. Others suggested dimensional manipulation. Nobody seemed certain because dragons vanished before proper study could be completed. The last confirmed sighting was 3,000 years ago. After that, nothing. No bodies, no remains. No evidence they had ever existed except for these old files and the stories that persisted across every human culture that had encountered them. David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. Copper, silver, and gold were definitely growing. Yesterday they had been the size of large dogs. This morning, when he checked on them before dawn, they were closer to ponies. At this rate, they would be too large to hide within a week. A knock on his door made him jump. He closed the database and went to answer, finding his neighbor Peter from the machine shop looking worried. "You need to see the news feed," Peter said without greeting. "It's happening everywhere." David followed him downstairs to the community area where a dozen colonists had gathered around the main display screen. The Galactic News Service was showing reports from multiple worlds. Shaky camera footage captured creatures that looked exactly like copper, silver, and gold, though in different colors and sizes. Some were small like his three. Others were already massive, causing panic in populated areas. The news anchor spoke with barely controlled alarm. Reports continue to flood in from across settled space. These creatures, matching historical descriptions of the dragon species believed extinct for millennia, have appeared on more than 40 worlds in the past 2 weeks. Authorities are struggling to explain how a supposedly extinct species could return simultaneously across such vast distances. David felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't alone. Dozens, maybe hundreds of people were experiencing the same thing he was, but nobody understood what was happening or why. The display switched to an interview with a scientist. David listened carefully, committing details to memory. The expert explained that dragons weren't native to any known world. Ancient texts suggested they were the first species to achieve space travel, long before humans or any currently known civilization. They had been guardians, protectors, though, of what or whom the records didn't specify. Peter noticed David's expression. "You've seen them too, haven't you? The lizard things behind your bakery. There was no point lying. The whole colony would know soon enough." David nodded. "They're not dangerous," he said quietly. "At least mine aren't." "Yet," Peter replied. "But they're growing. Everyone can see that. Security is planning to round them up before they become a threat." David spent the rest of the day preparing. If security came for copper, silver, and gold, he needed a plan. The creatures trusted him. They came to him for food and safety. He couldn't let them be captured or killed because people were afraid. That evening, a woman arrived at his bakery just as he was closing. She was older, maybe 60, with sharp eyes and the confident bearing of someone used to being listened to. She introduced herself as Dr. Harriet Lane, xenobiologist, and she knew about his 3 dragons. "I'm not with the government," she said before he could protest. "I'm independent research. I've been tracking these creatures since they started appearing. May I see them?" David hesitated, then led her to the back alley. Copper, silver, and gold were waiting, now unmistakably pony-sized. Their scales had developed an inner luminescence that made them seem to glow faintly in the dim light. Dr. Lane approached slowly, hands visible and non-threatening. Copper watched her but didn't move to intercept. She studied them with obvious fascination. "Remarkable. They've bonded with you. Do you know how rare that is? Ancient texts mention bonding, but I've never seen confirmed documentation." She turned to David. "How did it start?" He told her about finding them in his waste container, feeding them, watching them grow. As he spoke, Gold moved closer and pressed its head against his leg. The contact sent a wave of sensation through him that wasn't quite touch. It felt like emotion, like someone else's feelings briefly overlapping his own. Contentment, safety, home. "They're communicating with you," Dr. Lane said, noticing his reaction. "Empathic connection. That confirms the bonding." She pulled out a portable scanner and took readings, careful not to disturb the creatures. "These 3 are healthy, well-fed, and showing no signs of aggression. But I need to be honest with you, David. The Galactic Council is terrified. Dragons were apex predators, the most powerful species known to exist. Now they're returning and nobody knows why. There's talk of declaring them an extinction-level threat." "They're not threatening anyone," David protested. "Look at them. They just want to be safe." "I know. But fear doesn't require logic." Dr. Lane finished her scans and straightened. "I've documented 17 cases of successful bonding like yours. In every case, the dragons show intelligence, restraint, and loyalty to their bonded humans. But I've also documented 5 cases where unbonded dragons became confused and dangerous. Without the connection, they don't understand this world or these times." Copper made that metal scraping sound again, but softer this time. Silver moved to stand beside its copper-scaled companion. Gold remained pressed against David's leg. "What do I do?" David asked. "Security will come eventually. I can't hide them for much longer." "No, you can't." Dr. Lane met his eyes seriously. "But I can help. I have contacts who believe these creatures deserve protection, not extermination. We need to prove dragons can coexist with humanity. We need to show the Council that bonded dragons are allies, not threats." Before David could respond, an alarm began wailing across the colony. The security alert system, used only for genuine emergencies. Both of them rushed to the front of the bakery where other colonists were gathering in the street. Someone had broken into the security office database. Corporate mercenaries from a company called Helios Corporation were en route to Rustfall. Their mission was simple and brutal: capture dragons, kill them if necessary, but secure specimens for research at any cost. They would arrive within hours. David looked back toward the alley where copper, silver, and gold waited. Dr. Lane was already pulling up maps on her portable device. "There are canyon systems 40 kilometers from here," she said. "Deep enough to hide, defensible if we need to make a stand. Can your dragons travel that far?" David thought about the empathic connection, that brief touch of Gold's consciousness against his own. He thought about how Copper had protected him from the drunk miner, how Silver watched everything with calculating intelligence, how Gold always made sure everyone was safe before taking food for itself. "They'll follow me anywhere," he said with certainty. "Let's move." The canyons of Rustfall cut through the landscape like ancient scars, deep channels carved by water that had flowed billions of years before humans arrived. David led the way down a steep trail, scrambling over rocks while Dr. Lane followed close behind. Copper, silver, and gold moved with surprising grace despite their size, which had somehow increased again during the journey. They were nearly as large as horses now, their scales catching the dim light of Rustfall's distant sun. They had been traveling for 6 hours, putting distance between themselves and the colony. Behind them, David knew, Helios Corporation mercenaries were probably landing at the spaceport. The corporation specialized in military bioengineering, turning natural organisms into weapons. The thought of what they would do to copper, silver, and gold made him push harder, ignoring the burning in his legs. Dr. Lane called for a rest stop when they reached a wide ledge overlooking the canyon floor. David collapsed against a rock wall while the three dragons settled around him in a protective triangle. He could feel their concern through that strange empathic link, worry for his exhaustion mixing with their own alertness. "We need to talk about what's really happening," Dr. Lane said, pulling out her research tablet. "I haven't told you everything because I wasn't sure you were ready to hear it. But circumstances have changed." She showed him files marked with the highest security classifications, documents she should not have possessed. David read through genetic analysis reports, archaeological studies, and theoretical papers about dragon biology. "Dragons possess something called genetic memory," she explained. "Information passed down through generations encoded in their very cells. They don't just remember their own lives. They remember their ancestors' lives going back thousands of years. When the dragons disappeared 3,000 years ago, they didn't die out. They went somewhere and they took all their knowledge with them." "Where?" David asked. "That's the question nobody can answer. But look at this." She pulled up a genetic comparison chart. "I've analyzed DNA from 17 bonded dragons, including yours. Every single bonded human shares specific genetic markers. Rare markers that appear in less than 1% of the population. The dragons are choosing their companions based on genetics." David studied the chart, not fully understanding the technical details but grasping the implications. "You're saying they were looking for specific people?" "Not just looking. Waiting for them." Dr. Lane's voice held a mix of excitement and fear. "There's an ancient title in the dragon texts, Starfather. It appears repeatedly, but translations are unclear. Based on what I'm seeing, I believe it refers to humans who carry these specific genetic markers. Humans who can bond with dragons. Humans who might have been partnered with dragons long ago before recorded history." Gold lifted its head and made a soft sound. The word appeared in David's mind, not spoken but understood. Starfather. The dragon was confirming what Dr. Lane had said, and David felt the weight of recognition in that simple acknowledgement. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I'm nobody. Just a baker. Just a guy who left the military because he was tired of fighting." "Maybe that's exactly why you were chosen," Dr. Lane suggested. "Someone who values peace over violence. Someone who feeds hungry creatures instead of chasing them away." Before they could discuss further, Copper rose to its feet with a warning growl. The dragon's head turned toward the canyon entrance, scales bristling. Silver and Gold flanked David immediately, their bodies tense. The mercenaries had found them faster than expected. 6 figures in tactical armor emerged from between the canyon walls, weapons trained on the dragons. Their leader, identified by the rank insignia on his shoulder, spoke through an external speaker. "Stand away from the creatures. They're corporate property under salvage law. You're interfering with legal acquisition. They're living beings, not property," David shouted back. "And they're bonded. You can't just take them. We can and we will. Last warning." The mercenary leader raised his weapon. David saw the targeting laser paint a red dot on Copper's chest. His dragon, the brave one who had protected him from the drunk miner, who had been first to trust him, who had led the others to safety. Something broke inside David. Not fear, not anger, but a fierce protective instinct that he had felt only a few times in his life. He stepped in front of Copper, spreading his arms. "You'll have to go through me." The mercenary seemed surprised by this, surprised that an unarmed baker would challenge 6 trained soldiers. The man's finger moved toward the trigger. Gold screamed. The sound was nothing like the soft chirps or rumbling growls the dragons had made before. This was raw, primal, a noise that seemed to tear through reality itself. David felt it in his chest, in his bones, in parts of his mind he didn't know existed. The empathic connection exploded outward, carrying Gold's emotion with it. Rage, protection, family. The mercenaries' equipment sparked and died. Weapons, armor systems, communication devices, all of it flickered and went dark. The men stumbled, disoriented by the sudden loss of their technology. In the silence that followed, all 3 dragons moved forward, positioning themselves between David and the threat. They had grown again. Impossibly fast, impossibly large. Now they were the size of small vehicles, their scales gleaming with inner light. Copper's breath came out in heated waves that made the air shimmer. Silver's claws scraped grooves in solid rock. Gold's eyes held an ancient intelligence that made the mercenary step back in instinctive fear. Dr. Lane was typing frantically on her tablet, the only device that still worked. That pulse. It was concentrated electromagnetic energy, released through their empathic connection. I've never seen anything like it. The power required to do that across multiple targets simultaneously would be... She trailed off, staring at her readings. The mercenary leader recovered first. Without his weapons, he tried a different approach. You don't understand what you're protecting. Dragons were the galaxy's apex predators. When they ruled, every other species lived in fear. They're waking up now all across settled space, and when they're all grown, when they're all active again, humanity won't stand a chance. You're wrong, David said quietly. Look at them. Really look. They could have killed you just now. That pulse could have stopped your hearts instead of your equipment. But they showed restraint. They protected without destroying. For now. But their nature will emerge. Predators are predators. Copper made a sound that might have been laughter if dragons could laugh. Through the connection, David felt the dragon's amusement at the human's ignorance. Silver moved closer to Dr. Lane, who carefully reached out to touch the dragon's scaled shoulder. Gold remained at David's side, protective and calm. Leave, David said. Tell your corporation that these dragons are bonded and under protection. Tell them there are witnesses and documentation. Tell them that if they come back, we won't show restraint next time. The mercenaries retreated, stumbling over rocks in their hurry to leave without functional equipment. When they were gone, David collapsed to his knees, shaking with reaction. The 3 dragons surrounded him, their large bodies blocking the wind, their presence a comfort against his fear. Dr. Lane knelt beside him. We can't stay here. Once they report back, Helios will send more forces. Bigger forces. But I think I know where we need to go. Where? There's an old research station in the northern ice fields. Abandoned for years, but it has the equipment I need. David, what Gold did today proves something incredible. These dragons aren't just returning randomly. They're connected to each other somehow, even across vast distances. That pulse disabled technology for miles. I detected it because my tablet has specialized shielding. But every dragon on this planet probably felt it too. David looked at Gold, who watched him with those mirror-bright eyes. You called them, didn't you? You called for help. The dragon pressed its head against his chest, and another vision flooded his mind. Not words, not thoughts, but pure imagery. Thousands of dragons sleeping in darkness that wasn't quite space and wasn't quite anything David had words for. A place between places. A dimension of waiting, and they were waking up because someone had called them home. Not Gold, not any single dragon. Him. David Walsh, a baker from a nowhere colony on the edge of civilization, had somehow activated an ancient protocol embedded in dragon DNA. He was the Starfather, the one they had been waiting for, and now thousands of dragons were stirring from a sleep that had lasted 3,000 years. We need to get to that research station, he said, standing on shaky legs. We need to understand what's happening before the entire galaxy tears itself apart trying to stop it. Ice covered everything at the research station. Frost patterns decorated walls that hadn't seen human activity in decades. And David's breath formed clouds as he followed Dr. Lane through corridors lined with dormant equipment. Copper, silver, and gold had to remain outside, too large now to fit through standard doorways. They waited patiently in the snow, their bodies generating enough heat to melt circles in the ice around them. Dr. Lane worked quickly, restoring power to essential systems. Lights flickered on section by section, revealing laboratories filled with aging instruments and data storage units covered in dust. This place had been built to study Rustfall's unique geology, but abandoned when funding dried up. Now it would serve a very different purpose. Help me with this, Dr. Lane said, clearing debris from a large display terminal. When it activated, she began pulling up files from her personal archive, spreading them across multiple screens. Genetic maps, historical records, dragon sighting reports from across the galaxy, mathematical models that David didn't understand but that seemed to worry her deeply. The situation is worse than I thought, she said after an hour of analysis. Dragon sightings have increased exponentially in the past week. 50 worlds now, 100. The rate of appearance is accelerating. Most are like yours, small groups of juveniles bonding with humans who carry the genetic markers. But not all. Some dragons are emerging without bonds, confused and frightened. They're causing chaos because they don't understand where they are or when they are. She pulled up news footage. Dragons attacking security forces in self-defense. Dragons fleeing into wilderness areas. Dragons being hunted by military units. The images made David's chest tight with anger and sorrow. The Galactic Council meets tomorrow, Dr. Lane continued. They're declaring dragons a code black threat. That's extinction level. It gives them authority to eliminate dragons by any means necessary. We have maybe 20 hours before kill orders go out across settled space. We have to stop them, David said. These creatures aren't threats. They're just lost. They need help, not extermination, I agree. But we need proof. We need to demonstrate that bonded dragons are different, that they're safe, that they can be integrated into galactic civilization. The Council has agreed to a proving ceremony. If we can show them that dragons under bond act with intelligence and restraint, they might reconsider the kill order. What does a proving ceremony involve? You and your dragons face a series of challenges designed to test control, intelligence, and non-aggression. It will be broadcast across the galaxy. Billions will watch. If you succeed, you save dragonkind. If you fail, or if anything goes wrong, the kill orders execute immediately. David looked out through the laboratory windows at copper, silver, and gold. They had grown again, now the size of large shuttles. Their wings, which had been small ridges on their backs, had developed into full spans capable of flight, though they hadn't tested them yet. They were magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. When do we leave? He asked. A transport ship arrives in 6 hours. But David, you need to understand what you're walking into. Helios Corporation knows about the proving ceremony. Their CEO, a man named Gideon Ross, has been pushing the Council toward the kill order. He wants dragons declared non-sentient, so his corporation can legally harvest them for military applications. He's not going to let your success stand in the way of his profits. What can he do? The ceremony will have witnesses. Galactic officials, cameras. Never underestimate what desperate men will do when enormous sums of money are involved. Dr. Lane saved her data and shut down the terminal. We should prepare. The dragons will need to demonstrate specific behaviors. Flight control, precision, restraint under stress. Can you communicate with them clearly enough to coordinate complex actions? David honestly didn't know. The empathic bond let him feel their emotions and occasionally receive images or impressions. But detailed instructions? That was untested. He went outside and approached the 3 dragons. They raised their heads as he came near, and he felt their attention focus on him like spotlights. Gold moved closest, pressing its massive head down to his level. The dragon's eye was larger than David's entire head now, a swirling mirror that reflected his own uncertain face back at him. We need to do something difficult, he said aloud, feeling somewhat foolish talking to creatures who communicated through sensation rather than words. People are scared of you. People want to hurt you. We have one chance to prove you're not dangerous, that you're intelligent and worthy of protection. Do you understand? Gold's eye swirled with colors he couldn't name. The empathic connection strengthened, and suddenly David wasn't just receiving emotions from the dragon. He was receiving understanding. Gold knew exactly what he meant. The dragon pulled back and made a series of sounds to copper and silver, clicks and rumbles and that metallic scraping noise. The other 2 responded in kind. They were talking, planning. David realized with a shock that they had been communicating among themselves all along, that their intelligence far exceeded what he had assumed. Copper spread its wings for the first time, the membranes catching light and revealing intricate patterns like stained glass. Silver's scales shifted colors, adapting to match the surrounding ice and snow in a display of camouflage that left David stunned. Gold rose on its hind legs, standing tall enough that its head reached the research station's 2nd story, and breathed out a stream of air so precisely heated that it melted a perfect circle in the snow without scorching the ground beneath. They were showing him what they could do, demonstrating their control and precision, telling him without words that they were ready for whatever challenge came next. Dr. Lane emerged from the research station looking grim. We have a problem. I just received a priority message. Gideon Ross has announced that Helios Corporation found the dimensional breach point where dragons are emerging. He claims they're going to stabilize it, control the flow of returning dragons, but according to my contacts, they're actually planning to use a reality anchor to trap emerging dragons in a control matrix. They'll effectively weaponize every dragon that comes through. Can they do that? David asked. The technology exists. Reality anchors are used in quantum research to create stable observation points in dimensional space. But using one on living beings on creatures coming out of whatever impossible place dragons have been sleeping for 3,000 years? It could work. Or it could tear a hole in space-time that nothing can repair. We have to stop them. After the proving ceremony, if we divert now, we lose our chance to save the dragons that are already here. If we let Gideon proceed, we lose all the dragons that are still waiting to emerge. There's no good choice, David. We can only do what's possible and hope it's enough. The transport ship arrived on schedule, a small diplomatic vessel marked with Galactic Council insignia. Its captain was a stern woman named Patricia Hill, who made clear she was following orders but didn't necessarily agree with them. The cargo hold was barely large enough for 3 full-grown dragons, and Copper, Silver, and Gold had to fold their wings tight against their bodies to fit. David sat with them during the journey, feeling their unease through the bond. They had never been confined in such a small space. They had never been surrounded by so much metal and machinery. He tried to project calm, tried to assure them that this was temporary and necessary. Dr. Lane spent the flight preparing him for what to expect. The proving ceremony would take place on the neutral station above the capital world. 5 challenges, each designed to test a different aspect of dragon behavior. Other bonded pairs would participate, but David and his 3 were considered the primary test case because Copper, Silver, and Gold were the largest and most developed. "Remember," she said as the station came into view through the viewport, "billions will watch this." Their fear, their prejudice, their willingness to commit genocide against an entire species. All of it comes down to what happens in the next few hours. No pressure. David laughed despite himself. When you put it that way, it sounds easy. Gold pressed against his side, and through the bond came a sensation he had felt before. That first night in the alley when they were small and desperate. The feeling they projected when he gave them food and safety. Trust. They trusted him completely, and that trust was both a gift and a terrible responsibility. David placed his hand on Gold's scaled shoulder and made a promise to himself and to them. Whatever came next, whatever challenges or dangers or political machinations awaited, he would not let these creatures down. They had chosen him, fed him their loyalty with the same consistency he had fed them bread. Now it was his turn to prove worthy of that choice. The proving arena stretched across the entire central section of the neutral station, a massive open space with transparent walls that allowed viewers from all sides to watch. David stood at the center with Copper, Silver, and Gold while thousands of delegates and officials filled the observation galleries. Beyond them, millions more watched through broadcast feeds that reached every corner of settled space. He had never felt so exposed in his life. Every movement, every breath, every flicker of uncertainty on his face was visible to billions. The weight of expectation pressed down on him like physical force. Beside him, the 3 dragons remained calm, their presence a steady reassurance through the empathic bond. The ceremony's moderator, a high-ranking council official named Timothy Walsh, no relation, floated at the center of the arena on a gravity platform. His voice boomed through speakers embedded in every surface. "We are here to determine whether the species known as dragons can coexist with galactic civilization or whether they represent an extinction-level threat that must be eliminated. 5 challenges will test control, intelligence, restraint, and the bond between human and dragon. Success requires perfection. Any sign of aggression, any loss of control, any indication that these creatures cannot be safely integrated will result in immediate termination protocols." David felt his heart hammering. Perfection. They demanded perfection from creatures who had been awake for less than 3 weeks, who were still learning what the modern galaxy even was. Through a side entrance, other bonded pairs began entering. David recognized some from Dr. Lane's reports. A young man with a smaller blue-scaled dragon, an elderly woman with a sleek black dragon that moved like liquid shadow, a military officer with a scarred red dragon that had clearly seen combat. In total, 7 pairs, including his own. But before the challenges could begin, the arena's displays flickered. Every screen suddenly showed the same image. A man in expensive corporate attire standing before what looked like a tear in reality itself. Gideon Ross, CEO of Helios Corporation, broadcasting from the dimensional breach point. "Citizens of the galaxy," Gideon's voice overrode the moderators. "While the council wastes time on theatrical demonstrations, We have taken action to secure humanity's future. Behind me, you see the breach point where dragons emerge from their dimensional refuge. We have installed a reality anchor that will allow us to control and direct this process. No longer will dragons appear randomly across our worlds, causing chaos and fear. Instead, they will emerge under controlled conditions, where they can be properly studied, trained, and put to use protecting civilization. Dr. Lane, watching from the observation gallery, stood up with alarm visible even from a distance. Her voice came through David's personal communicator. "David, that anchor isn't positioned for control. The energy readings are all wrong. He's not trying to stabilize the breach. He's trying to force it wide open and trap everything that comes through." On the screens, the reality anchor activated. The dimensional breach expanded, tearing wider like a wound in space itself. Dragons began emerging, dozens at once, then hundreds. But they weren't waking naturally. They were being yanked through, disoriented and confused, immediately entangled in energy fields that locked them in place. Gideon continued his speech, oblivious or uncaring about the pain his anchor was causing. With this technology, Helios Corporation will ensure that every dragon serves the greater good of humanity. They will be bonded to military operators, trained as weapons, deployed where needed. The age of uncontrolled dangerous species is over. Through the bond, David felt copper, silver, and gold react. Their distress wasn't for themselves, but for their kin being tortured through Gideon's anchor. The dimensional breach wasn't meant to be forced. Dragons were supposed to wake gradually, naturally finding their way through when the time was right. This violent extraction was like ripping someone from deep sleep directly into a nightmare. Gold screamed. Not the defensive pulse from before, but something deeper. A call that transcended normal sound. Every dragon in the arena responded, their voices joining in a chorus that made the station's structure vibrate. Through the bond, David understood what they were doing. They were calling back, reaching through dimensions to their trapped kin, trying to comfort them, trying to help them endure. The moderator tried to restore order. Silence the creatures immediately or face termination. "No," David said, his voice barely a whisper at first. Then louder. "No. You want to see what dragons really are? This is it, not weapons, not threats. They're trying to help. They feel every one of their species suffering through that anchor, and they're reaching out despite the risk to themselves." Security forces moved toward the dragons with weapons raised. The other bonded humans tried to calm their partners, but the emotional wave was too strong. Every dragon felt the wrongness of what Gideon was doing. Through the bond, David felt something shift. Not his consciousness, but the collective awareness of dragonkind. They were all connected, had always been connected, linked through dimensions by bonds that humans couldn't fully perceive. And in that moment of crisis, with their species being weaponized and tortured, they reached out to the one human who might understand. The Starfather. Knowledge flooded into David's mind. Not visions this time, but pure information. Memories from countless dragon generations, understanding that had waited 3,000 years to be shared. He saw the truth of what dragons had been, what they had chosen to become, and why they had disappeared. Dragons had ruled the galaxy once, yes, but not through domination. They had been guardians, protectors of younger species struggling to survive in a hostile universe. They had bonded with early humans when humanity was still confined to one world, teaching them, guiding them, preparing them for the vastness of space. But power corrupts, even noble power. Some humans wanted to use dragons as weapons. Some dragons began to see themselves as superior rather than equal. The partnership was breaking, threatening to destroy both species. So the dragons made a choice. They went into stasis, removing themselves from the galaxy, waiting until humanity matured enough to meet them as true partners rather than masters or servants. 3,000 years they waited, and the trigger for their return was specific. When humans who carried the ancient bonding markers, descendants of the original partners, began appearing in significant numbers again. When humanity had spread far enough, diversified enough, learned enough to be ready for what dragons truly were, not weapons, not pets, not servants or masters, family. David opened his eyes, not realizing he had closed them. The arena had gone silent. Every dragon, including copper, silver, and gold, was staring at him. Every human was staring at him. He had been standing there for several minutes, they told him later, while the collective consciousness of dragonkind, downloaded 3,000 years of genetic memory directly into his brain. He should have died. The human mind wasn't designed to contain such information, but the bond protected him, distributed the knowledge across the network, connecting him to copper, silver, and gold. They held him together, kept him sane, while he became the bridge between species. "I know what we have to do," David said. His voice sounded strange, layered somehow, as if multiple voices spoke through his throat. "We have to stop Gideon before the anchor tears the dimensional breach beyond repair. But I can't reach him from here. The dragons can, though. If I act as a conduit, they can coordinate across any distance. Every bonded pair working together." Dr. Lane's voice crackled through the communicator. "David, what you're describing is impossible. The energy required to coordinate hundreds of dragons across light years of space would kill you. Your nervous system can't handle that much information flow." "It can if they help me." David looked at the other bonded pairs in the arena. "All of us together. Share the load. Show the galaxy what partnership really means." The young man with the blue dragon stepped forward first. "I'm with you," the elderly woman nodded. "My partner and I are ready." One by one, the pairs agreed. 7 humans, 11 dragons. Not nearly enough for what needed to be done, but it was a start. Through screens still hijacked by Gideon's broadcast, they watched the reality anchor buckle under strain. The dimensional breach was tearing wider, and dragons were still being pulled through, trapped, suffering. Gideon shouted orders to his technicians, demanding they increase power, stabilize the field, capture more subjects. David reached out through the bond, connecting not just to copper, silver, and gold, but to every dragon in the arena, then further to bonded dragons across the station, then impossibly further to dragons on nearby worlds. The pain was immense. His body wasn't made for this. Blood ran from his nose, his ears. His vision blurred. But the dragons held him together, their collective strength supporting his fragile human form. Through this network, David spoke a single command in the first tongue, the original language of dragonkind that predated all human speech. "You are free, choose." The trapped dragons heard him. Through dimensions, across impossible distances, the message reached every captured creature in Gideon's energy matrix, and given the choice, given the freedom to act, they made their decision. Every dragon shattered their restraints simultaneously. The energy feedback overloaded Gideon's anchor. David watched through 1,000 dragon eyes as the device exploded, as corporate mercenaries fled, as Gideon himself stared in horror at his investment and his plan collapsing around him. But the dimensional breach was still tearing, still expanding, destabilized by the anchor's destruction. If it continued, it would collapse and potentially tear a permanent wound in space-time. David felt copper, silver, and gold make their decision before they moved. All 3 dragons opened their wings and launched themselves toward the arena's exit. The other dragons followed. Security tried to stop them, but the moderator overrode the order. "Let them go," Timothy Walsh said quietly. "Let's see what they choose to do." Space stretched infinite and cold around them, but David barely noticed. He stood on the observation deck of a commandeered transport ship, while copper, silver, and gold flew alongside in formation with dozens of other dragons. They moved through vacuum as easily as atmosphere, their biology adapting in ways that human science still couldn't explain. Behind them, more dragons followed, a growing stream of scaled bodies reflecting starlight. They were racing toward the dimensional breach, toward the collapsing wound in reality that Gideon's failed anchor had left behind. David could feel it even from this distance, a wrongness that made his teeth ache and his vision swim. Through the bond, he felt the dragons' determination and their fear. The breach was tearing wider with each passing moment. If it collapsed completely, thousands of dragons still waiting in stasis would be trapped forever, cut off from this reality. If it exploded outward, it could consume entire star systems. Dr. Lane worked frantically at the ship's science station, analyzing data streaming in from remote sensors. The breach is expanding exponentially. Current projections give us maybe 15 minutes before it reaches critical instability. Even if we get there in time, I don't know what we can do. We'd need massive amounts of precisely controlled energy to seal something like this. Energy levels that would require a fleet of ships or... She trailed off, staring at her readings. "Or what?" David asked. "Or several hundred dragons working in perfect coordination, channeling their bioelectric fields through a single focal point." She looked at him with something between hope and terror. "David, this is what the Starfather was meant for. Not controlling dragons, not commanding them, being the connection point that lets them work together at scales that should be impossible. Through the viewport, the dimensional breach came into view. It looked like a wound torn through the fabric of space itself, edges crackling with energies that hurt to observe. Gideon's destroyed anchor drifted nearby, twisted metal still glowing from the feedback explosion. Around it, freed dragons circled uncertainly, too disoriented from their forced awakening to know what to do, and still more dragons were coming through the breach, pulled by momentum that Gideon had started and that now couldn't be stopped. They emerged confused and frightened, some injured by the violent transition, all of them sensing the imminent collapse. David closed his eyes and opened himself fully to the bond. Not just to copper, silver, and gold. Not just to the dragons who had followed from the arena, but to every dragon in range, every consciousness that touched the vast network connecting their species. He felt hundreds of minds, thousands, each one ancient and young simultaneously, carrying memories of generations while experiencing the present moment with fresh wonder. The collective weight of their awareness threatened to overwhelm him again, but this time he didn't fight it. He let himself become the conduit, the focal point Dr. Lane had described. Through this connection, David spoke not in words but in pure intention. He showed them what needed to happen. The breach couldn't be sealed from the outside. Something had to stabilize it from within, anchor it long enough for the last dragons to emerge safely, then collapse it gently rather than catastrophically. Something like a living body that could withstand dimensional forces. Something that could channel massive amounts of energy without burning out. Something that had survived 3,000 years in dimensional stasis and could handle a few minutes more. He was asking dragons to volunteer for what might be a suicide mission. To enter the breach, to hold it stable with their own bodies and bioelectric fields, to possibly be trapped forever in the space between spaces. The response came immediately. Not hesitation, not fear, but something that felt like fierce joy. Dragons volunteered by the hundreds. They had been waiting so long to serve their purpose, to protect rather than be protected. To prove themselves worthy of the partnership they had sacrificed everything to preserve. Copper broke formation and flew directly toward the breach. David felt his dragon's determination, the absolute certainty that this was what needed to be done. Silver and gold followed without hesitation. All three of his companions, the creatures he had fed bread in an alley just weeks ago, were choosing to risk themselves to save others. "Wait," David whispered, but they were already moving. Dozens more dragons followed. They positioned themselves around the breach's perimeter, forming a living net of scaled bodies and outstretched wings. On David's signal, channeled through the bond, they began releasing their bioelectric energy in coordinated pulses. The effect was immediate and spectacular. Lightning arced between dragons, forming patterns of incredible complexity. The breach's expansion slowed, then stopped. The edges stabilized, crackling less violently. Through this controlled framework, more dragons emerged from stasis, guided safely through by their kin holding the passage open. But the strain was enormous. David felt it through copper, silver, and gold. The energies they were channeling weren't meant for living beings. Their scales began to crack. Their wings trembled with exhaustion. Some of the smaller dragons faltered, their strength giving out. "We're losing them," Dr. Lane said, her voice tight with emotion. "They can't hold it much longer. David, you need to tell them to let go before they kill themselves." But there were still dragons coming through the breach, still consciousness emerging from stasis, still members of their species who needed guidance home. To release the breach now would trap them forever, condemn them to an eternity of half-wakefulness in dimensional nowhere. David felt Copper's resolve through the bond. His dragon would hold until the last one was through or until strength failed completely. Silver and gold shared that determination. They would not abandon their purpose. The choice should have been impossible. But looking at his companions, at these magnificent creatures who had trusted him with nothing more than day-old bread and gentle words, David realized the choice had already been made. Not by him, by them. They were showing humanity what it meant to serve something greater than individual survival. "I won't let you carry this alone," David said. He pushed deeper into the bond than ever before, not just observing or coordinating, but merging. His consciousness flowed through the dragon network, distributing itself across hundreds of minds. Where they bore the physical strain, he bore the mental strain. taking their pain and exhaustion into himself so they could hold just a little longer. His human body back on the transport ship collapsed. Blood poured from his nose and ears. His heart stuttered, struggling with the impossible demand being placed on it. Dr. Lane shouted for medical equipment, but David barely heard her. He was everywhere and nowhere, spread across the Dragon Collective, feeling what they felt, holding what they held. The last dragon emerged from the breach. A small one, golden-scaled like gold, probably a juvenile who had entered stasis millennia ago and was waking to a universe it didn't recognize. Copper caught it gently with one massive claw, pulling it clear of the dimensional rift. Now came the hardest part. Collapsing the breach without exploding it required draining energy gradually, letting it dissipate rather than detonate. The dragons began drawing power inward, absorbing the dimensional energies into themselves. It was like swallowing fire. David felt every moment of it, their scales burning, their bodies pushed beyond any reasonable limit. But they held. Together, linked through the bond, supported by David's consciousness distributed among them, they held. The breach collapsed gently, folding in on itself like a flower closing for the night. The dimensional rift sealed with a flash of light that painted every dragon's scales in rainbow colors. Then it was gone, leaving only normal space and the exhausted dragons who had saved thousands of their kin. David's consciousness snapped back into his own body so forcefully that he gasped, choking on blood. Dr. Lane was there, medical equipment pressed against his chest, keeping his heart beating. Through the viewport he could see copper, silver, and gold flying back toward the ship. They were battered and burned, their beautiful scales cracked and dull, but alive. Still alive. The ship's communication system activated. Timothy Walsh's voice, the moderator from the proving arena, came through clearly. The Galactic Council has witnessed everything. The proving ceremony is complete. By unanimous vote, dragons are recognized as sentient beings with full rights and protections under galactic law. The kill orders are rescinded. David Walsh, you and your bonded companions have proven beyond any doubt that dragonkind and humanity can not only coexist but can accomplish, together, what neither species could achieve, alone. David tried to respond but couldn't find words. He was too tired, too damaged from what he had just done. But through the bond he felt Copper's response. Not words, but a sensation. The same one from that first night in the alley. Home, family, trust. 6 months passed before David felt strong enough to return to Rustfall. The doctors said he should have died a dozen times over from what he put his body through. But dragon biology had somehow stabilized him during the worst of it, changing him in ways that medical science was still trying to understand. He would carry scars, both visible and not, for the rest of his life. But he would carry them alongside companions who bore similar marks. His bakery had been rebuilt in his absence. The colonists, embarrassed by how they had initially reacted to the dragons, had worked together to create something special. The new building was 3 times larger, with reinforced walls and a massive rear courtyard where dragons could rest comfortably. They called it Starfather's Bakery, a name that made David simultaneously proud and uncomfortable. Copper, silver, and gold lounged in the courtyard, their scales healed but marked with permanent patterns where cracks had formed during the dimensional breach. Other dragons visited regularly now. Rustfall had become a gathering place for newly bonded pairs, somewhere they could learn and adapt without fear of persecution. Dr. Lane had taken up permanent residence, establishing a research center dedicated to understanding dragon-human bonds. She worked with a growing team of scientists and her own dragon Ember, helped identify juvenile dragons who needed guidance, adjusting to the modern galaxy. David stood at his oven, hands covered in flour, baking bread the way he had before everything changed. Except now, when he brought out the day's production, he had hundreds of customers instead of dozens. Humans and dragons alike came to taste what he made. Drawn by the story of how simple kindness had changed the galaxy, a young woman approached his counter, nervous and uncertain. She held a tiny dragon in her arms, no bigger than a cat, with scales that gleamed copper and gold in the light. "Sir, I found her near my quarters. I don't know what to do. I'm just a maintenance worker. I'm nobody." David smiled, recognizing his own words from months ago. He reached into the display case and pulled out a fresh roll, still warm from the oven. "Feed her," he said gently. "Then come around back. I'll teach you what it means to be somebody." The woman took the bread with trembling hands. The tiny dragon accepted it eagerly, eating with the same desperate hunger that copper, silver, and gold had shown in his trash container all those weeks ago. Behind him, gold made a sound that was definitely laughter. Or approval. With dragons, David had learned it was usually both. Copper and silver watched with what he could only describe as satisfaction, proud of their human for passing on what they had taught him. That small acts of kindness could change everything. That family was chosen through daily care, not bound by blood or species. That the most ordinary people could become extraordinary when they chose compassion over fear. David returned to his baking, content in the knowledge that somewhere across the galaxy, other bakers and mechanics and ordinary people were making the same choice he had made, feeding hungry creatures, building trust, creating bonds that would hold civilization together through whatever challenges came next. And in the courtyard behind his bakery, 3 dragons who had once been desperate hatchlings rummaging through trash now stood as guardians, ambassadors and proof that the smallest gestures could ripple across the stars.